Good afternoon. So this is a topic that I've been thinking about for a long time. I have found that etiquette in this game is surprisingly complicated. I think that most of the time, whenever I'm playing games, my opponents are very gracious and kind and willing to, forgive and all this. But when you get into, and that even includes like really competitive environments. But with LVO going on right now, it's just been something that I've been thinking about and I've been having conversations with lots of people in the Discord about. And I'm just curious what you think. Here are kind of my thoughts about it on etiquette in Age of Sigmar. So before the game starts, how are you and your opponent going to decide the outcome of the game should you run at a time? I think that these things are often stated in like battle packs and things, but it is something that is worth thinking about and worth discussing with your opponent in competitive environments, but also like not the most extreme competitive environments. So this might be, leagues or Path to Glory games and the like. So it's definitely worth thinking about. Also, people have different opinions about when dice should be re-rolled or when they are quote unquote cocked dice. So this is something that you should talk about with your opponent before the game starts. A very easy way to get around this problem is rolling inside of rolling trays or in boxes where that opportunity is not really going to come up. But if you like rolling on the table like I do, then if the die is at all on anything, are you rolling it again, or is it only if it's kind of, really cocked or, so that's definitely worth having a conversation before the game begins. I mean, just in general, like laying out, having a conversation with your opponent, like, well, are we having a really casual game? Is this a game that you're trying to practice or learn for a competitive environment? Or is this the top table at LVO for the 5-0, for the big win, right? Like, having a discussion with your opponent and laying out the sort of expectations is important. But more on that later. Now, there is definitely a difference between competitive and casual environments. When you are in a casual environment, I feel like it's a good thing to ask questions like, have you ever played against a Greenskins army before? If they say no, well, then you can give them an overview of the mechanics, you can review your list, you can do all kinds of things. While personally, I don't like this. I don't like the info dump at the beginning of the game. Like when I play an opponent, if I'm not super familiar with what their army does in a casual environment, then because that's the only time that I don't know what their army does is in a casual environment. In a competitive environment, I generally always know everything that my opponent's list can do, and I usually have notes on it. But in a casual environment, I don't really like the info dump. All I really want to know are just like a brief overview. But you can tell your opponent, you can start with the brief overview, and then you can go from there. However, in a competitive environment, I feel like you can ask your opponent, like, do you have any questions about my army? Because if you're playing at the top table at LVO, I believe that when the assumption that you and the other player have with each other is that, well, we're obviously both skilled players, and part of being a skilled player is understanding all the nuances of the rules of the game as a whole, but also specifically of each other's armies and factions and so on. So, if you say like, hey, do you have any questions about my list? And your opponent says no, you're good to go. They don't want any information, right? And then the middle ground between those two things is reviewing gotcha mechanics. So even if you're at the top table, like some players prefer to be very upfront about any potential gotcha mechanics, which is totally fair and legitimate. So like, hey, do you know what the Wargog Prophet does? Do you know what the Wargog Prophet does? Just so you know, Bolt Boys are nasty. They deal a lot of damage, right? Like, just so you know, I also can move, after we deploy, I get to move something, because I have super sneaky. So that's kind of the middle ground, is, at minimum, sharing any really important gotcha mechanics that are in your army. Hey, did you know Gobsbrack's going to blow your casters' heads off? So that is definitely, there's disagreement here from people. Some people think that when you're at the top table, just being like, hey, any questions? No? Good luck, have fun. To me, that's appropriate and fine. Other people would still rather always explain their gotcha mechanics in all contexts all the time, and that's fine too. But as soon as you're not at the top table at LVO, I feel like reminding your opponent of your gotcha mechanics matters and is important and is good etiquette. I think it's better to be on that side. So even if you're at a tournament, if you're in, the first round or whatever, and you're playing against someone, it's like, hey, like, here are my gotcha mechanics. Let me tell you these first, and then, are you familiar with orcs in general? No. Would you like me to tell you some things? Yes. Okay, off you go, right? So that's the do you have any questions versus have you ever played Greenskins before idea. So I was talking to a friend of mine that I play with, Jason. Thanks, Jason. And he sort of explained, his thought was that all of the information in this game is open source. You can find any information about all the rules, all the mechanics, all the lists, everything in this game. So if your opponent has a question, you better answer them. If your opponent has a question about your army, it would be bad etiquette to not tell them, first of all, or to leave out important pieces of information on purpose, because you're left with a choice. If your opponent's like, hey, what does that do? If you're like, oh, well, you should really know how that works, your opponent can say, okay, and then pull out their phone and spend half of the time looking up all your rules because you refuse to share it with them. So you might as well just share it with them. All the information is available. So just for, convenience sake and just to be a good sport and a good player, you should probably just share all this information with your opponent. There's no reason to withhold information from your opponent. And then explaining any gotcha mechanics like Orgog. Yeah, so we went over that. Okay, so during the game. So there's this idea in Age of Sigmar about playing to intention, where you should take the intention of your opponent as the rule over the actual rules themselves, and then reminding your opponent about things like, hey, did you mean to move outside of 3 inches of that piece of terrain for super sneaky? Because if you move there, you won't get your tactic. That is a very polite thing to do, a very etiquette-driven thing to do. Or if your opponent moves things around and they're like, oh no, like I'm actually 3.1 inches away from this model, and I meant to be I meant to be within 3 inches of this model. Even at top tables, it's like, of course, because maybe the model got touched or moved a little bit, or maybe, so playing to intention matters quite a bit, right? And I feel like that is one of the primary rules of etiquette, is playing to intention versus playing to rule. Yes. And then there's this other idea that another person in my Discord, Leonard, shout out to Leonard, that we were discussing, which is, are there things in the game that, if you forget them, still have to be ruled? Are there any mandatory rules? The way that I feel that I and most other players play this game is that if you forget to do a thing, and it sort of passes, then it's over, right? It's kind of too late. My rule of thumb for this, when I'm playing even in casual games, I will let you do a thing that you forgot, or I'll let you take back a move that was a mistake, as long as it's not going to impact anything that has happened since then, right? So if I attack you in the combat phase and I kill a whole bunch of your models, and then you attack me back, and then we do this other thing, and then we do the battle shock test, you're like, oh, I actually forgot they have +1 save. Can we reroll? It's like, well, no, because so many things have happened and I've made decisions based on that information. So it's kind of too late. And I feel like your opponent should be more than willing to understand that, it's like it happened and we've moved on from there. And we've both made more choices since then, where if there was a change in outcome, we may have made different choices, right? Those things matter, right? Redeploy is another one. It's like I moved, and then you chose not to redeploy, and then so I moved these guys over here, and then you're like, oh, can I redeploy the first unit? It's like, well, I would have moved them differently if you did. And I don't really feel like I need to backtrack a unit of 10 Gut-Rippas so that you can, like, you know what I mean? It's like, it's kind of too late. Like, there is a sense of a card laid, card played. And I would say that at top tables and in hyper-competitive environments, that's how you would kind of play it, right? It's like, well, no, like, that has already passed. Like, you would be more rigid on that. But what Leonard points out is that and I'm not sure about this, so you can let me know. And I don't want your opinions. I want facts. I want to know if there's something in the game that states things that have to happen. We were comparing it to Magic the Gathering, where triggers are not optional. They happen. You don't get to pick. They just happen, right? And obviously the onus is on the player to remember their own rules and their own triggers. But that's where we were sort of getting into discussion is it your job to remind your opponent of their rules, of things that would benefit them? If your opponent forgot to make a 4-up ward roll, are you obligated as a player at the table to say, hey, you forgot to make your ward roll, so why don't you do your ward roll before we move on? Is that an obligation, even in the most competitive environments, to do that from a rules perspective? I would love to get your thoughts in the comments or in the Discord. In a casual environment or in a learning, practicing environment, I would say yes. I would say that you want to do that because you're not just trying to win the game. You're trying to learn and improve and have a good time. And so if you remind your opponent of things that would be helpful to them, I think that is good etiquette in casual environments. In the most hyper-competitive environments, it's a little bit different. However, if you knowingly withhold that information, I would say that's probably not a good thing either. I don't know. It's weird. Let me know what you think. So calling judges. If you think your opponent's cheating, call a judge. If you and your opponent can't seem to agree, then call a judge. If your opponent did not, so this is why, if your opponent did not do a thing that would have hurt them, like for example, if your opponent is like, actually, we're in the middle of the combat phase and I just activated a unit and fought with a unit that I forgot to make a battle shock check with the turn before, I think that's also a good time to call a judge. If your opponent failed to do something, whether they did it by accident or not, that would have hurt them, and now it's sort of moved on from there, because this is a situation where obviously there needs to be something that happens in the game because your opponent failed to make this check. And if I was in a competitive environment, I would just want a judge's opinion because it's going to matter. It's going to matter, and so it's difficult for you and your opponent at the table to come up with a resolution. You can, but even then, I feel like just asking a judge's opinion and being like, hey, what should we do in this case, is probably a good thing. So obviously you call a judge if you think your opponent's cheating, if your opponent is wrong on the rules, if your opponent is arguing with you, if they're not being a good sport, all those things. But then also if something's kind of going on, even if it was by accident, I think that's also a good time to call a judge. Let me know any stories that you guys have about times you've been in competitive environments and you've called judges over. I'd be super curious to know what the judges thought and what they said and what the resolution was and so on. So let me know in the comments and in the Discord. Another good thing during the game is agreeing on charge rules and other rules before rolling. So if you have to make some measurements and say, it's always a good thing to say, okay, well, this is an 11-inch charge. What do you think? Yes, I agree it's 11-inch charge. Cool. So that when I roll the dice, we're not then debating, right? Somebody, this was from another person on my Discord, M. Mattis. Thanks so much. But if you both agree it's 11 and then you roll 11, well, you've already agreed. You can't be arguing and debating those things before after they actually happen. And then dice rolling. Roll where your opponent can see. Don't roll the dice behind terrain on your side of the board. I like to reach my hand way out into the table and roll them in the middle of the table. You can do this in a tray or you can do this on the table, whatever. A tray's better, but I just don't like rolling in trays. So make sure you do it where your opponent can see. When you're removing dice, remove all the failures, right? Remove the failures. Don't remove the successes. Remove the failures, because then if you accidentally remove a success, well, you removed it. It's gone. And then your opponent can then see all the dice on the table and say, yep, those are all 5s and 6s or whatever. So you should be removing your sixes. And then also, you should really have dice that your opponent can see. If you're watching the video and not just listening to it, you can see I have two examples of some green dice. One, they're green and they have these brown spots, and it's going to be difficult for your opponent to see them from across the table. And the other one is green with white spots, and it's actually quite easy for your opponent to see the dice from the other side of the table. My wife is half blind, right? And she has a difficult time, or she has a harder time than those with 20/20 vision, let's say, actually seeing the dice that you're rolling. And so I feel like having dice that are easily visible is good. Personally, I don't like it when the sixes have symbols, but that's just me. I've seen dice before, I think I have anyway, I might be confused or mistaken, where the ones were like skulls and the sixes were like faction symbols. And if I'm gonna play 5 games in 2 days, like I don't want that. I just want the ones and sixes. I want to be able just to see what the roll is without having to be like, oh, like are those sixes, right? And then maybe that's a good thing to explain to your opponent before the game. Hey, you see my dice? These are the dice I'm going to be using. You see that this symbol here is a 6 and this symbol here is a 1. But then again, it's like my dice just are D6s. They just have 1 through 6, right? I get that people like the fancy dice, but that's just me. If you're playing with dice with symbols on, it's like, it's fine. Like it's not a big deal or anything. It's just not my personal preference. Yeah, so I mean, what did I miss about etiquette? And I'm just going to read this comment that Blade, who's been a big contributor to this discussion, said. He said, we were talking about playing versus intentions versus playing to the rules. And he says, it's a polite way to catch people who don't actually know their rules. So it's a good way to... so, for example, quote, I'm giving this buff to that unit. And then, bruh, that unit is definitely not wholly within, and there's a forest in the way, and ask them to look up their rule rather than telling them that they're wrong. So even in a competitive environment like at a tournament, if you're playing against someone who has less experience than you, you can still be very polite and not like be confrontational and argumentative, but you can just sort of be like, is it okay if we double check that? Like, like is it wholly within or is it just within? Like there are polite ways of checking, and even players who are experienced and who are very good players, like game is hard. Game is complicated. I can think of 2 examples. Just the other day, I think 2 days ago, I played a game for the first time since this new GHB has been out, and I didn't know that if you get a critical success with a primal die, like sixes, that both players get another primal die. I've been misplaying that for this whole GHB, and I was playing with somebody in my league like a month ago, and they thought that you have to pick the characteristic, like with the spell Hoarfrost, they thought you had to pick either rend or to hit or to wound before you roll the die, not after you roll it. So I rolled my Hoarfrost die and I got a 3, and I'm like, cool, I'll give 3 rend. And then he was like, well, no, you have to pick first. And I was like, well, no, you. And so we had a polite little discussion about it briefly, and then we looked it up, and then we had a polite discussion about it, right? And then it was, oh yeah, here, like, turns out I was correct. But he's a very good player. He's been playing tabletop games for a really long time, and he had been playing that rule wrong since the beginning of the GHB. And he said, I think everyone has been playing that wrong, because I believe that a lot of people that he knows, like in these play groups that are around me, that they've all been playing this rule wrong. So people are going to get their rules wrong, and when they do, you can very politely bring it up. You don't have to bring it up in a way that is, confrontational or mean or what have you. Anyway, what did I miss? Let me know in the comments. Let me know in the Discord. Like, subscribe. Wah.